ladies and gentlemen. It's been quite a while since the end of the Second World War, about 14 years. We all know that America has made great progress since then. But what has really happened since the end of the war? What progress have we made? In today's production, we will talk about the presidential elections over the years, Eisenhower's presidency, the rise of poverty, and the housing crisis following the war. Talking about the political scene of America, there's no person better to interview than the professor of political science at Yale University, Professor Giulio. So, Professor, what can you tell us about the political scene within the last decade or so?
Well, Mr. Frost, starting with the election of 1948, Harry Truman and Thomas Dewey went against each other. Truman won the election with 303 electoral votes over Dewey's 189, and Truman having 49.6% of the popular vote and Dewey having 45.1%.
So what kind of sort of time frame did all of this happen?
So January of 1948 was when the campaign officially started, but in November, a few months later, was when Truman was officially elected President of the United States. He was president for 4 years, up until 1952, when Eisenhower completely demolished him with the popular votes. Eisenhower won again in 56 and is still president as we speak.
So what would you consider a significant point during all this time?
Well, I would say one of the most important parts in Truman's presidency was when he presented his program for domestic reform in 49, calling it the Fair Deal.
Could you expand on that a little?
Yes, of course. It was a really big deal, but in short, it was a collection of programs and policies that were very much desired by the Democratic Party, like liberals. Some of these programs and policies were an increase in minimum wage, economic controls, and repeal of Taft-Hartley, and etc. Things like that.
So what about Eisenhower?
So Eisenhower won against Truman in 52 because of his I Like Ike campaign, which is it brought him a whole bunch of popularity, leading to a Republican victory, and he keeps that popularity to win again in 56.
So today, following Professor Giulio, for our next segment, we actually brought on Vice President Nixon.
All right, thank you so much for having me here today.
So today, who are we here to talk about?
We are here to talk about President Eisenhower's presidency, basically.
So throughout his presidency, what are the most impactful things he's done, good or bad?
One of the most impactful things I believe he has done so far in his presidency was sign the Civil Rights Act of 57, and this covered ending segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Something else he did was he was sure to keep our military. He was part of the military, so he, of course, had something at heart for the military, and he was very sure to make sure that they were in perfect needs at all times and ready for combat anytime, shape, or form.
So when did all this stuff happen?
It happened from the basis of the 50s, so 1952 all the way to 59. It was a very distinctive time period.
All right, well, thank you for coming on.
Of course.
E-M-E-I-O-K-A, galloping all the way, here comes Spring Robin Brown.
Kellogg's, the best to you each morning from Kellogg's.
E-M-E-I-O-K-A, galloping all the way, great big star on his chest. Out from all of the rest, fastest gun in the West. E-M-E-I-O-K-A, riding around your way, here comes Spring Robin Brown. The highfalutinist, fastest shootin'est cowboy you ever saw. That's Spring Robin Brown.
Brought to you by Kellogg's, your best choice in cereals, the best to you each morning.
Welcome back from that short break. Today we have an economic expert with us, Kennedy Schindler, and she will be talking about us with poverty.
Well, Mr. Frost, poverty is about not having enough money to meet basic needs, including food and other resources, such as clothes and shelter. Poverty will always be a constant problem as long as money exists in our economy.
All right, and now that we know that what that is, can you talk about like poverty within the past like decade or so?
So poverty started to rise and become more visible to the U.S. in 1950s. It started much before this, but this was when it was at its worst in the recent times. One of the largest reasons that poverty hit a rise is because at the end of World War II, less food and other crucial resources were imported from foreign countries, which are now in recovery, so it makes it harder for them to import said resources.
And during this time, like, who was most impacted, and kind of where were they?
The most impacted people by this poverty rise were elderly folk and single women and their children, along with minority groups such as African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and illegal U.S. citizens.
And where were these people living?
Most of these people and other people affected by the rise of poverty were in rural areas or open lands and farmlands.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing that with us.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me on the show.
No problem. So for our next segment, we'll be talking to none other than my own brother, John Frost. Now, he is a specialist in the housing market. Now, sadly, we couldn't get him into the studio today, but we had to talk to him elsewhere. Yeah, thank you for having me on. So I'm sure as the people at home have noticed, there have been big changes to how the housing market works now. Could you possibly go into what those changes were and why they were made? Yeah, of course. So one of the main changes would have been the suburbs and those Levitt towns. As many of you may recall, about like only 10 years ago, most of us were living in urban environments. But because of like the soldiers coming back from the war and then the baby boom following that, most like people needed housing. So the suburbs were created with essentially the same house being built over and over again. So obviously this greatly impacted the market. And when did all of this stuff start? Yeah, so like all this stuff started really happening around like 49 to like 52-ish. Wow, so that was all fairly recent. How was all that stuff achieved? So these mass-produced houses were made by these large construction companies, and they just built house after house using like essentially assembly line methods. Like there was a house being built every 16 minutes. Thank you for tuning in to today's broadcast. I hope you have a nice night.
Brush your teeth with Colgate. Colgate Dental Cream. It cleans your breath.
What a toothpaste.
Well, it cleans your teeth.
Colgate toothpaste.
Cleans your breath.
What a toothpaste.
Well, it cleans your teeth.
Remember, only Colgate Dental Cream is proved so completely it stops unpleasing breath. Colgate's cleans your breath while it cleans your teeth.
Look.